Thank you all for being here this morning. My name's Robin Shuey. I'm the Director of Grants and Programs at the Kuni Foundation, and we appreciate you taking time today to learn about stable housing needs for our neurodiverse neighbors. I'm so pleased that we have such a wonderful panel today. Madeline Barron from ECONorthwest, Jennifer Knapp from Community Vision, and Allison Stark from Albertina Career Centers. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to pass you on over to our wonderful speakers. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Robin, and good morning, everyone. We just did our introductions. I'm Madeline Barham. I'm a senior project manager with ECONorthwest. Just a little bit about my firm. We are an economics consulting company headquartered here with about 75 people across the Pacific Northwest and a few people scattered across the country. And we primarily do research and analysis to answer really important questions like the one we're going to talk about today about housing and urban development and economic insecurity. We do a lot of social policy practice and a lot on housing, especially in the past about decade. The firm's about to turn 50 years old, but we have a wide array of research areas, and mine in particular are housing, affordable housing, sort of housing supply writ large, and then homelessness and housing insecurity. So in 2020, as the kind of program describes, the Kuni Foundation hired ECONorthwest to evaluate housing insecurity for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we were excited to study this concept and tackle these research topics. Not knowing very much about this population, we dove headfirst into the research and quickly uncovered how tricky it would be to answer that question. It sounded like a pretty simple one, but once we started digging deeper, we actually realized we needed to take a big step back and just, it required a much more fundamental question to start, and that was simply just how many individuals are there in Oregon with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And again, sounds like an easy question to answer, but it was a challenging topic to study, and particularly because of the lack of data on this population. As an economics firm, we rely on publicly available data. We did interviews to supplement what we were studying and qualitative information to supplement the quantitative information, but we ultimately rely on, population statistics. We quickly uncovered that the research was, the literature and the data was incredibly poor. I could say like appallingly, shockingly bad compared to what we're sometimes used to studying and or populations that just sometimes get more attention. I'll just be frank. And so we identified that the best accepted prevalence rate. So we had to, in order to answer the question of just how many people might there be in Oregon who have these characteristics, we surveyed the research literature and found a study that was completed back in 2001 that came up with a prevalence rate, which is really just per capita, how many people meet these characteristics. 2001, so 22 years ago. And that study was relying on nationally representative census data dating back to the 1990s, dating back to 1994 and 1995. Basically, the federal health department, one of the health departments in the federal government, did a supplemental census, kind of like a deeper dive that was nationally representative of the population that allowed researchers to have insight into the daily living characteristics and developmental delays and just other characteristics of the entire population. And from that data set, they were able to create a prevalence rate. And unfortunately, it has never been updated, and it is the best, to this day, still the best research, particularly on adults. So you can see here that the Larson study, that's the one that was done in 2001, suggests there's about 8 people per 1,000, 8 adults per 1,000 adults over age 18. Who meet the characteristics to be identified as having intellectual and developmental disability. A study was done in there's been lots of other studies done, but none of them kind of rise to the level of the rigor and the nationally representative sample that the Larson study does. One that was conducted in 2017 was sort of a wider net, and it was focused on children, and that rate, my slide's cut off, I apologize. But that study identified children at about 70 people per 1,000. And as a researcher, you just are like, what is going on there? Nothing happens between age 18 and age 19 to cause such a big disparity. But we also know that the children's rate is likely much more accurate because children are constantly being evaluated and monitored for developmental delays and other characteristics as they grow up. So nevertheless, this is the best data that was available to us. So I put this first because it underscores everything else we're about to talk about. And everything that I'm about to talk about, you should keep in mind as being like a severe undercount, that these data are not great and they're old and undercounting this population. And so while we try to be accurate and we try to use statistics and methods we can stand behind, it's just probably an undercount. So I'll move on. So when we looked at just simple, and on the chart, you can see those estimates of, the chart that you saw on the prior slide showed how many people, adults and children in Oregon were estimated using those prevalence rates to have IDD. We then looked at the Oregon Developmental Delay, ODDS, I can't remember what it stands for. They have caseloads, and that was we segmented by age. So we were trying to identify, again, with this population, you could compare a prevalence rate to the number of people receiving services from the state. And you can see these outline bars are the giant gaps between those numbers. And so again, as a researcher, you want to try to corroborate the statistics, and this was a glaring gap. When we did interviews and with just talking with people and what we read in the research, especially for children, the giant bar, it can be understood from the context of stigma and fear in families, maybe not wanting to associate and talk with the state's services. Oregon and many other places in the country have a really negative, horrible history of institutionalization and discrimination against this population. So that maybe not to that exact scale, but the desire to maybe not receive services can be understood. You can see with regard to the adult population, the bar in the quote unquote gap is a lot smaller. Again, it's an undercount with the prevalence rate, but also there's just more, I think there's more interest and perhaps a greater need for adults with intellectual developmental disabilities to be receiving those services, and maybe less fear. But again, probably an undercount. So one of the benefits, again, this data is also quite old. Apologies about the statistics being cut off there on the bottom, but a really wonderful research institute out of the University of Colorado is one of the best sources in the Larson study. This woman works there. They have gone a little bit further in evaluating through qualitative information and quantitative information within the population of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Where do they reside? And so you can see in the bar chart, this is the Oregon statistic from 2017. They used to update a study every 2 years. So we received this information in 2019, but it was using 2017 data. And then with the pandemic, I think they stopped updating their study, or we weren't able to get more recent data than this, but it shows the breakdown of who amongst Oregon is living in different circumstances. So alone or with a roommate at the top, the middle is in a supervised residential setting, and then the largest component is living with a family caregiver, and that's about 61% of the total in Oregon. Importantly for our study, they also estimated of those living with a family caregiver, what would be the caregiver's age? And that was a really important question for our study on housing insecurity, because that broke it down, as you can see with the statistics, that of the adult population, well, no, this is the entire population, but at what age is the caregiver? And 27% in Oregon had a caregiver over the age of 60. That was important to us as far as ability to kind of triangulate housing risk. That one stood out to us. We know that generational statistics and population statistics, that the aging there's an aging baby boomer cohort. So we identified that group as one of the ones. Here we go. Okay, so we identified that as one of the groups that we could use to broad strokes categorize as perhaps being housing insecure. So this chart shows the 3 different living arrangements in the research that we were able to access: supervised residential setting, living alone or with a roommate, and living with a family caregiver. So the first line is probably a little controversial in this room, but we had to assume that those living with in a supervised residential setting were not at risk of housing insecurity. And I know that that's not a great assumption, but there was no other data set we could access that would identify any sort of risk for those types of settings. I know that many of them are, you know, family owned or small organizations, not institutions or institutional dollars. So they might be at risk of closing, or as those mom and pop group homes age and retire, there's some risk there, but we had no information to kind of quantify that. And so we had to just have that not so great assumption that there was no housing risk. And that's at least for the quantifiable information that I'm gonna share on the next slide. For the portion of the population living alone or with a roommate, we used census data to estimate what share. We assumed all of those people would be adults because they're living alone. Or with a roommate, they're independent. And then we used census data to kind of approximate what portion might be experiencing cost burdening. So when their rent or housing costs account for more than 30% of their income, we know that this population tends to have lower incomes due to labor market participation challenges. And so cost burdening is a really big problem for low-income households, especially renters. You're one kind of life bump in the road away from maybe being evicted or facing homelessness. So that's a pretty important risk there. And then, like I said before, in the last category of those living with a family caregiver, we used that group of 27% whose caregiver was over age 60. And I mean, for anyone who's over age 60, I apologize, but like that, we just had to blanket say that that was a risk because of aging caregivers. And when, again, no offense, but you know, it was just the best we could do to approximate with the baby boomer cohort aging that will, you know, perhaps they need their own care in a couple of years. They won't be able to care for their family caregiver. And especially when we look at how many adults might not have been receiving state services, who might be adult individuals with IDD who might be living with a family caregiver and might not be receiving state services. This is especially risky because if their caregiver, you know, maybe falls and breaks a hip and can't care for themselves, and then they can't care for their family member, or maybe if they pass on unexpectedly, we read, and it's common in the literature and I think in interviews, that estate planning and planning for the future housing needs of their family member, it often falls to the back burner, or there's not enough education, there's not enough resources. So that was identified as an important risk factor. And in particular, both of those categories, because Oregon's housing market is hot and expensive and has tight vacancy, if any, you know, sudden experience pushed these people from housing insecurity into needing to find their own place, like there's just not a lot available. There's no supply. The regulated affordable housing stock is very limited. And so this is the quantification of those two categories of those living with a family caregiver. About 15,200 adults across the state were categorized as having housing insecurity. And of those living alone or with a roommate, assuming the cost burden rate, about 5,500 adults across the state would be considered. So it's a right over 20,000 adults in this study that we identified who would have housing insecurity. And again, that's an undercount. We know it's an undercount. We can say with pretty near certainty, despite there not being better data, that that's a severe undercount. So we can't quantify how much larger it might be, but given that the childhood prevalence rate and the adult prevalence rate, you know, we're orders of magnitude off, it's reasonable to assume that it's much larger than this. This is also 2017 information. It's already been 6 or 7 years since then. So Oregon's housing market has gotten worse. Cost burdening is probably worse. The aging caregivers is probably worse. We probably can assume that the share of those living with a family caregiver whose caregiver is over age 60 has gotten bigger. We also, this study had done some statistics for the Kuni Foundation's, their service area includes Southwest Washington. So there are statistics in this report. The report is still available on the website of the Kuni Foundation. We also included some statistics about Southwest Washington. In a subsequent year, so this study was done in 2020, and then in 2022, the Washington State Legislature also wanted to kind of evaluate the same criteria. So we repeated the study for the Washington Developmental Disabilities Administration. And Washington's a bigger state, but we followed the exact same formula and found about 37,000 individuals, adult individuals there facing the same housing insecurity. So that's a big, my role in my firm is often to be the wet blanket. And so, we always end on a positive note, and there's a lot more positivity coming, I promise. But when we were also looking at, so what do you do about this problem? And what do you do about housing insecurity? So the biggest, we couldn't say it loud enough, is improved data collection and try to find those, the state and community agencies and state contractors should make every effort to try to identify individuals that they haven't been able to be in touch with before, through social networks, through churches, through support groups, things like that. But also the state could very well enhance its own data collection and tabulate different data sets, maybe from the Health and Human Services Department or OHCS or other agencies that might touch this population. And then, definitely conducting additional outreach. Of course, we also, everyone in this room knows, we need to increase housing options and housing choices and housing affordability. This includes additional rent regulated units. I think when we calculated this before, Oregon does not have a specific set aside in the regulated affordable housing industry that will dedicate units for this population. So that seems like it could be, it's not easy, but a low hanging fruit. So something like the qualified allocation plan for the LIHTC program, that's one of the biggest affordable housing, you all know this, affordable housing funding programs. So go ahead, the advocates could try to get a set aside, try to get a preference point, try to get some sort of a boost for projects to be more competitive if they include units specifically dedicated for this population. The Portland metro area has the supportive housing services tax measure and the money flowing through the metro regional government. So that's an option. It definitely includes people at risk of homelessness and people who have disabilities. So the challenge there is that tax is set to sunset in 10 years. And so banks won't underwrite to it. So even though it does provide services associated with a 0 to 30 unit, a 0 to 30 AMI unit, which would be deeply affordable for this population, but probably still not affordable enough. You can't underwrite to it. And when you're developing a unit, so that is a structural challenge with using that money, but it's still there. And then essentially, it's very critical to preserve the existing affordable housing stock that exists. And everyone in this room knows how important that is. It's way more expensive to build new. So we got to keep what we have, make sure it doesn't expire. And then, we also heard a lot about housing and service coordination and the fact that they're really not very coordinated and that there's laws preventing one organization from being both a housing provider and a service provider. And those are very well intentioned, but maybe they could be re-examined for cost efficiencies and for just logistics efficiencies. We also heard about in-home support funding is often not enough to reimburse the providers, the service providers, or even just the way it's structured presents challenges for the owners and operators of this housing. That is it. I will pass it on to my next panelist, who will be a lot more hopeful.
Well, it's helpful to be grounded in the data, right? But for those of us who have been working in the disability field, none of this was a surprise, right, of how much need there was. So just to reintroduce myself, my name is Jennifer Knapp, and I'm the executive director of a local disability service provider called Community Vision. So we work in the Portland metro area. And data like what Madeline just shared is very motivating to us to say, we got to do something about it. And so over the last few years, in 2020, actually, we launched a housing access program. And so we wanted to dig in deep to say, okay, we know it's bad, but what can the solutions be? How can we be part of the solutions? And so our program is, again, just an example of one of the things that can be done. And what I'm going to share today is kind of the 3 lessons learned from that and the ways that I think we can move the ball forward. So how it works is the main thing that we do is actually help match people to affordable units. So one of the biggest challenges for folks with disabilities is knowing what's out there, right? How can you find the affordable housing that might exist? And so we actually work with people and do some planning to figure out what their needs are. If they have accessibility needs, because there's quite a bit of crossover between people who have physical disabilities and intellectual and developmental disabilities. And then to do some planning to figure out where they need to be, what their situation is. And then we provide tenant education classes because many folks in this population have never lived on their own. And so how do you know what your rights and your responsibilities are as a tenant? We actually offer rent well, which I'm sure is very familiar to a lot of you for people who have that need, because some people have tried and it hasn't worked and been evicted. So having that support is really helpful. But for other people, it's just that learning curve. As Madeline mentioned, so many people are still just living with their families well into late adulthood. And so for some people, just that first step of learning about it is a huge, important step. And then the heart of it is really actually helping people to apply and to find that match. So we've developed a database of a lot of your properties, I'm sure, for the people who are in this room, to match those units. And I've been actually connecting folks to community resources. So it has been really exciting to, over the last 2.5 years, we've supported 90 people to move out on their own here in the Portland metro area, which feels like a big number for us and certainly is encouraging that it's possible. And you can see the eligibility requirements are, and I want to be clear about this, we do have for this program in particular, that people are making at least $1,200 a month, which is obviously very low, but for many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, they're living on just Social Security income. So I want to acknowledge that this amount is higher than if people just have SSI. That's full disclosure, that's real, and that's just because of where the housing prices are. And then that they're eligible for either IDD or physical disability services. Those work a little differently. We're going to get into that a little bit. And then again, for us, we are just in the Portland metro area. So that's just a little bit about our program. But what I really want to do today, let's put here, is talk to you about what we have learned and want to share from our perspective what we think are the 3 keys to making the statistics that Madeline talked about change. And so I'll give a brief overview here, and then we're going to dig in a little deeper to all of these. So first is understanding what the basics of IDD services are. And one of the things we've had to learn from coming from the disability side and learning about all of you in the housing world is there's 2 different languages. And housing people have a whole different world, like AMI and those sort of things that we didn't know anything about. And in the disability world, we have our own language and ecosystem. And so, again, we'll talk a little bit about the very basics and also from the housing perspective, what we need for services. The second thing, this won't be shocking, but is the biggest need, particularly for this population, is 30% AMI units and lower. And again, that's probably not surprising, but I think it is the main thing for here is that we don't necessarily need separate or special housing, right? It's just the affordability is the biggest thing. But then last but not least is the design. And that universal design is really a key for being able to welcome people with disabilities and everyone into apartments. So we'll talk more about that as well. Okay, so first one is about the services. So our big learning curve for you all, for the housing world, was understanding what services meant, and even for permanent supportive housing, right? Which is what often people are thinking about when they think about for folks with disabilities. And so what I want to share with you is that folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities tend to come with their own services. So they actually don't often need permanent supportive housing. And the thing, just so you know what that service can mean, is up to 24 hours a day of even one-on-one support. Not everyone is getting that, not everyone needs that, but when it comes to disability services, they're deep, right? There's a lot of them. And so coming to the housing world where you're used to having to spread services across a lot of people, I think this is actually helpful to know that while folks with disabilities often have higher service needs, they also come with those services that are funded through Medicaid. So again, I mentioned the good news of this is that you don't necessarily need PSH or a lot of the housing sponsored services for this group of people. The challenge is that there's a lot of entities to work with, right? There isn't just one provider that's doing all of this. And so figuring out who is the right person and the right contact can be a challenge. That's part of what we have started to do in our program too, is even just be a referral source, or like, hey, this is going on, who might be a good contact? Because we understand that for you all, again, I don't know exactly where you are in the housing ecosystem, but having a point of contact can be really helpful. So the main thing I want you to know is that people do come with their own services. And I think that is sometimes when I talk to people, they're nervous about, well, I don't know if this person could live here because what about daily hygiene needs or daily support? So the good news is that that is not something that you need to be responsible for as housers, but that will be provided through the Medicaid system. Oh, so here's an example of how that has worked in real life. So this is Jenny, and Jenny is somebody who used to live in a group home. So thought that that was going to be the only opportunity that she had. She is somebody who is proudly trans and is transitioning. And she didn't feel like she didn't want to be in a group home anymore. And also wanted to be where she could have her identity be whatever she wanted it to be. And so she came to our program, and this is one of the most challenging, right, is to go from a group home, what Madeline talked about earlier, which is those kind of regulated environments, to living on your own. And the cool thing about this is we had previously partnered with Sabin CDC. I don't know if y'all are familiar with them, but the picture over there is one of their new properties. So they had actually built it where all of the units are accessible, which is really cool. So they kind of took that universal design idea and just said, let's just do it with the whole thing. And so Jenny is somebody who uses a wheelchair. And so that was a need, was both how do we get the services happening for her, but also how can we find an accessible apartment? So Sabin was able to work with us. They had an affordable unit. So matched that part. And then the services, there was a service provider in the disability world called Community Access Services, and they were willing to provide the day-to-day supports. So again, we kind of just acted as the connector to both the apartment and the services, and now she has been happily living in her apartment. So kind of related, this second thing is, again, the biggest need is just affordability. And I want to be really, really clear that over and over, folks with disabilities keep telling me, I don't want separate housing. Like, I don't want it to be disability only, right? I want to be part of a community, part of where there's other people living. And so if you take anything from that, from this today, please take that, that people don't want special or different or separate. They want to be part of. And so again, I think, as I'm sure you all have experienced, and this is not unique to this population, but so many affordable units are at that 60% of area median income. And particularly here, that is just out of reach for the vast majority of people that we are working with. And so really trying to get to that 30% has been critical. And there's usually a few of those units in a lot of places, but not necessarily very many of them. And so one of the things we've been trying to do is, again, work on that rental assistance side to try to figure out how can we make more solutions, so that that's not just on the housing complex, but again, just want you to know 30% units are amazing. And then again, just recognizing that for this population in particular around affordability, to stay eligible for these services, they can only make so much, right? So I mean, everyone is struggling with affordability, but particularly for this group of people, if you go over a certain threshold, then you lose all of your access to your supports and all of the things that you need to live independently. So that's the real challenge, is that people are limited to often just a part-time job at the most. So yeah, just again, I think some of you probably know how that happens. If you ever want to go deeper into Social Security and all that, happy to nerd out with you. But for this purpose, just knowing that there's kind of a range that most people have to be within. So another example here of it can work. So this is Erin, and Erin is somebody who had kind of bounced around to different settings. She didn't have a family situation that was stable, and so kind of had tried living with friends, and didn't have a steady income either. And so we were able to work with another partner who was building Rock Creek Commons, which is a project-based, so that all of the units here were affordable. And so just thought it was pretty cool to hear her comment where she says, "Due to my disabilities, I've struggled in my life. I wasn't able to be focused on my health or self-esteem in my previous unsustainable living arrangements. Now I'm living consistently thanks to subsidized housing." So she's been on her own now for 3 years, and has been able to sustain it, and again, start to work on what else is going on in life. As we all know, housing first, we know that over and over and over, turns out also works for folks with disabilities. And then last but not least, for my points, is this idea of universal design, really being critical for creating an environment that is welcoming for folks with disabilities in addition to everyone else. And so the idea that the quick definition of universal design is design that is usable by all people without a need for adaptation or specialized design. So it's the idea that you create it so that you don't have to make a lot of changes for people, for them to be able to live there. And I wanted to make a note that, again, not all people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have a physical disability, but many do. There's a big overlap in those two populations. And that also the idea of universal design isn't just for folks with disabilities, right? There's many, and hopefully you all have heard about this concept by now. People have been really pushing it out in the world. But there are, for people aging in place, it is so critical. And people who are learning English, some of the wayfinding things that happen with universal design are helpful for that population. And just for flexibility in use, that's a big part of the focus. So towards that end, I wanted to share with you, we have been working with Bora Architects, and they have really been a leader in some universal design locally. And so we have actually just developed a universal design toolkit. So I have a couple available today. Also, if you're interested, I got a little sign up. I can send you a digital version. But the idea here is there's some really in-depth things about universal design. So for those people who are really interested, I can give you, there's hundreds of pages, but this idea was more of a primer. So what are the basic ideas? So it's things like, having no barrier entries, right? How can you use a trauma informed approach? There's, again, just lots of good nuggets in here, lots of visuals, lots of examples. So if you're interested at all, again, would love to have you come sign up, and I can give you a copy or get you a link to be able to actually see that, because again, it's all about how do you create an environment where people with disabilities can be part of communities. And with that, I will turn it over to Allison for a more specific example.
All right. It's like getting to that point in the session where everybody's a little like, we've been sitting listening for 40 minutes, right? So everybody stretch, it's okay. Yeah, do it. So my name is Allison Stark, and I often stand next to the podium because of my height. So hopefully I don't fall off the side. I am the CEO of Albertina Kerr. We provide children's mental health services as well as services for children and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities through residential programming, employment services, and we also have Wynn Watts Commons, which is a 150 unit affordable housing complex. And so, my background, I've actually worked in the IDD field my entire career. Prior to coming to Kerr, I was the state director of developmental disabilities for the state of Illinois. And coming here, I was super excited about Wynn Watts Commons because it is somewhat unusual for a service provider organization like Albertina Kerr to get into the affordable housing market. And part of it is because of everything that, we've been talking about so far, different languages. Housing is very, very different than services. Some might say a little bit of mission creep as well. And so, I think when you start talking about how do you blend these two things together, you have to be really clear what are the outcomes. But Wynn Watts Commons really came out of the idea that people with IDD are housing unstable, and they are also interested in affordable units, and there is a market for that. But that also the staff that work with our clients, the frontline staff, are also housing unstable. The reality is most people who with a disability that needs support in their home are working with a direct support professional. And these are individuals that are often making only a couple more dollars above minimum wage. And so they are also housing unstable, right? So in some ways, what Albertina Kerr was interested in doing was creating a model where affordability was both for the clients that we serve, but also for the people that are supporting the clients that we serve. And so it was kind of a dual purpose. So Wynn Watts Commons is in Gresham on 162nd, and Gleason is kind of the cross streets. It's 150 units. 30 of those are universally accessible, and they're also further subsidized with a 811 voucher so that people pay 30% of their income in order to live there. And then we own 3 units at Albertina Kerr because we are the owners of the building. We worked with a lot of partners to make this happen because, again, Albertina Kerr is not an organization that has ever done this before. And so we really relied heavily on Edlin and Company. With that being said, we are technically co-developers. So the developer fees, Albertina Kerr did, we split the developer fees with Edlin. Just to give a little bit more background, we also donated the land that the building is on. So it was about a $2.5 million piece of land that we donated to the project. And then we got, I can get into all the financing and all of that, but there was a lot of complexity to the project and a lot of partners, and we mostly funded it through tax credits. We finished it in June of 2022. We were fully leased by November 2022. And we actually hit stabilization about 2 weeks ago. So we are really excited about the project and the milestones that we've been able to meet. What am I supposed to point this at to make it move forward? That makes more sense. All right. So a little bit more about the building, and then I'm actually going to show a very short video on the universal design features because I think it's always helpful to actually see it. We have, I mean, I won't read all of this to you, but what's exciting about it and what we often say is that it's inclusive, accessible, affordable, and it's energy net zero. So the reality is that the solar panels on top of both the car parking as well as the building itself creates enough energy that no one pays any utilities costs nor Wi-Fi. Right, exactly, right? Because those things are extras, right, for people, so they don't have to worry about any of that. That's really exciting. The universal design features, one of the things I want to mention, and I know Jen kind of talked about this too, is universal design really helps everyone. The reality is it's not just for people with disabilities. One of the things we did in Win Watts Commons is that each floor is a color and is color coded. Frankly, that helps everybody, right? When you get off, you're like, I know I live on the blue floor. Okay, I'm in the right place. How many times have you gotten off an elevator and you thought, oh, this isn't my floor, and then you have to, get back on? And so really some of these universal design features that are, I guess we use the excuse of it's being for people with disabilities, it's really useful for all of us. And so we have throughout the building, all of our mailboxes are lower. We have a kick box, and you'll see this in the video in the elevator so that you can use your foot to actually open and choose your floor for the elevator, which is great because let's be honest, if I've got, a kid on one side and a bag of groceries, using my foot to do that is incredibly, helpful to me. So I think that, our ability to utilize these universal design features in ways across the building that have helped, that helps everyone who lives there has been really exciting. And then to Jen's point about people want to live in included environments, the units that are the 30 universally accessible units are across the 4-story building. So they're not all put in one area. People aren't being segregated. They are dispersed, and you wouldn't know what those units were, right? And what we've heard, because we actually don't serve anyone that lives in that building, but we have a number of service provider partners that do, is that people really love living there, which is super exciting. I think I'm going to go ahead and show the video, and then I'll leave time for questions for all of us. I don't know why I'm having the most problem with the clicker, but will you be able to? If you go on to and we embedded it into the slide deck, is it not? Because I was worried about this happening. Does anyone have any questions while we wait? Oh, lots. You were first. That's like the number one question we get. I'll be honest, I'm not sure. I mean, I love the building, and honestly, I go everywhere and I talk about how amazing it is, how much, how the impact that is made. But to be honest, as a services and supports, primarily a services and supports organization, it is a little bit of a departure for what we traditionally do. I think what we would be interested in doing is potentially having more partnerships with developers where we're not owners as well. Because when you're an owner, there's the asset management, we have a financial background on our team that we didn't have, and now we have to have the separate audit. I mean, all of the compliance issues, these are all things that are really, really new for us. And so, one of the jokes I've said to our board is like, we either double down and do tons of these, or maybe this is just the one-off, right? So the area that East County, which I know dinner distribution of services. So do you see any issues with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities So, as Jen was mentioning, I think one of the unique things about serving people with IDD is that they have, I mean, if they're receiving services, they have a case manager who helps coordinate services. They have a range of service providers to be supported by. We have probably, I want to say, 6 or 7 different service providers serving the individuals that are in that building. And the reality is it's not an issue because these are providers that would be serving this individual if they lived in their family home, if they lived in an apartment somewhere else. And so part of the brilliance of this is that you're never worried about the service provider, because even if that one service provider said, we no longer serve Gresham, which I think most of the ones in the area have a broad range, there's like 5 or 6 or 7 other service providers that could pick up the supports for that person, including Albertina Kerr. We just don't happen to have anyone who made the wait list and was able to access. Were we able to get it, or did we? Okay.
It's totally worked.
It's a really great video. It's a really great video. Being able to see it's really exciting. Well, sure. I mean, I can add, but I'm doing a lot of talking up here. Oh,
That's a great question. And here's the challenge, right? Is that we say universal, and yet there's a million different ways that people are unique. And so what we have found is that for most things, there's kind of a set of core principles that, again, physical access, some basic wayfinding, different things like that should be throughout the building. And then there still is going to be some level of adaptation for specific things. So, because you're right. I mean, actually, you'll see in the video, I won't give it away, but there's some lighting and things that are specific for folks who are on the autism spectrum that Albertina Kerr has put in their project. So I would say there's kind of, I think of it in 2 levels, right? Universal design being what needs to happen at the design phase so that it's not so expensive to do later. So for example, I'll give you a really easy example of even just putting backing in for grab bars in the bathrooms. So even if you don't install the grab bars themselves, if you have the backing there, which is, couple of 2x4s, right? It's pretty cheap to do while you're building. But if you don't do it before, you have to rip out the wall and put them in and then install the grab bars. But if you have that there, installing grab bars is actually not a difficult thing. So again, that's a simple example, but wider door frames, those kinds of things that if you do it while you're building, it's way, way cheaper. And then there's some other things. Again, you'll see some of the great features that are wonderful to be able to install, but also aren't so costly to install later. So I think that's when I think about universal design, I think about what are the keys for when you're building that you really want to stay static. And then there's other features that can have a little more flexibility. So hope that answers. And again, more details in the guide for sure.
did we find it? Because yeah. Yes, thank you.
This entire apartment complex was designed with universal accessibility in mind. From the moment you walk up to the building with its easy to roll in ramps to the elevators that you see that have toe kicks. The accessibility features are nowhere more apparent than when you roll up to one of the apartments. The door itself is remote control, so users can press it and just enter the door without having to use a key. Going into the kitchen, there is a stovetop that looks like a normal stovetop, but when you pull the handles, the stovetop rolls out so that somebody in a wheelchair can use the stovetop in a way that works for them. There are 2 cabinets that are controlled by buttons. You can push a button and the cabinet will come down slowly so that all the silverware and plates inside are easily accessible by somebody in a wheelchair. In the bathroom, you'll notice that you can roll under the sink. All surfaces are flat, and so you can roll right into the shower as well. All 30 universally accessible apartments come with Simply Home, an integrated application that allows residents to control their environment. The app is also customizable for each individual who uses it. These 30 universally accessible apartments are really important and they're unique. It allows people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to live independently, but to live as part of the broader community.
Yay, that's it. So one of the things I did want to talk about after the video, and I think I don't have any more slides, so you don't need to put them back up, is that we did pre-install Simply Home into all of the accessible units. And that does 2 things. One is there is a technology feature that someone who wants to control their living environment through an iPad, as you saw in the video, you can do that. And that's really exciting and I think really helpful for a lot of people, especially people in wheelchairs, because they can actually, a lot of people have their phones that will attach to their wheelchair and they can actually use then that app to control their environment. So that's one really exciting thing. The other thing, though, that we have is remote supports. So remote supports are a way to help people be more independent by having kind of the added safety of sensors. So they're not cameras, but sensors. So to give you an idea of how this would potentially work, is we have pre-installed sensors on the oven, for instance, because we sometimes hear, we worry, what happens if they leave the oven on? What will happen? What will happen? Well, this sensor actually will, if set up, which you have to go through a care planning process with the person to actually, use the remote supports. But if this is something that is a concern for an individual, not everyone will have this concern, we already have the sensor there. So through the care planning process, through the app, you can actually set up that if the oven is left on for more than an hour, that it will actually call the person in their home and it will tell them you've left the oven on. And if they don't answer it, you can actually set up another level of support where it'll call a parent, a caregiver, a support worker, whoever you set up in that process, it will call them. There are sensors that we have already installed in the bathrooms for water, because obviously that's another concern, is flooding and those types of things. We can put them on the door, we can sense movement, and really the creativity is what is used to determine how this would best support an individual, because no 2 people are the same, right? What I might need is different than what Jen might need. So for example, one of the things that we've heard is that people will put sensors on their beds, and if they don't get up in time to go to work, the sensor will call them. Right? But this is the way that technology, right, is helping people be more independent. Because I don't know about you guys, but I do not want to be followed around by a staff worker every day, all day of my life, right? I want to be independent, and so do people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so by using technology in this way, we're helping people be more independent, but we're also safely doing it and putting in backup systems of support and care just in case. So thank you.
So we wanted to leave about 15 minutes for questions. So I know you had a few for Allison already, but Robin will be, if I can get it to work, our question person for the people on Zoom so that they can hear you ask your question. So if people have questions for any of the 3 of us, we will take them now. It's red. Red. I figured that was a problem I could not fix.
Any questions?
I can talk loud. Allison, can you talk a little bit about the building cost, the Albertina Care project costs a heck of a lot more than anything else that has been built, and how do you accommodate that?
So the project cost about almost 46 million. And a lot of that was funded through tax credits. Albertina Kerr received generous support from the Kuni Foundation. We also got a lot of private dollars, about 1.5 million there. Obviously, the donated land helps. What I can share is that for the universal design features, because that's an added cost, it was about 30,000 per unit. I think you could get that cost down. I think we did a lot of things. Actually, some of the things that weren't mentioned in the video is that we actually soundproofed all the main bedrooms for individuals, autistic individuals, so that they could be, have a place that's a little more supportive of them, because communal living, that can be a real challenge, right? But we spent a lot of money doing all of that. We got also some Metro bonds that actually offset quite a bit of the cost of the universally accessible, I think to the tune of 11.2 million. So all in all, I think we're 30 million, I want to say, in for between tax credits and financing. But it's big money. I mean, right? I mean, like these are huge dollars, but it's so exciting. Like when you see it on the other side, you're like, it's so exciting.
I follow. So,
We have a microphone now. So when you're talking about this to other builders and designers, like this was experimental, you did it for the first time and you just said, I think there are a lot of ways we could modify that or change it. I find when we talk about it, we provide subsidized housing all the time when we allow people to be more independent and we subsidize the cost up front. It just reduces maybe some of the subsidy later. Are there ways that you're thinking about that as well, so that maybe state legislators will think about how they can contribute to projects like this and we can find other incentives that the public would support?
I mean, I'm sure others on our group would like to answer that, but I'll just start by saying that I think that I think what's amazing about thinking about this with individuals with IDD is that so much is already there, right? So you have access to vouchers, you have access to support. And so really a lot of this is getting people's, I think, developers' heads around how to do this. And I actually think that's one of the, and I don't want to say a challenge in a bad way, but that developers don't understand what we do. And we kind of sometimes don't understand what they do. I think that the legislators that we've shown the building are incredibly excited about it. I think what, is always the challenge is with limited resources for housing, where do those limited resources go? And the IDD community has tough competition from families, from, there's the need never ends, right? There's need everywhere. And so, we've tried to push this forward as an option for individuals with IDD, keeping in mind that we have some 3 bedrooms in our unit. We have 8 3-bedrooms that we have families living in and kiddos living in, and those are also really needed, right? So trying to kind of balance everything.
Yeah, just want to add that we have made some steps towards that. So just last session, we passed House Bill 3309, which was directing OHCS, Oregon Housing, sorry, I always say it wrong. Oregon, thank you, Housing and Community Services. Ooh, you get up here and your brain stops. But to actually figure out how to incentivize building more accessible units. And so now that's not necessarily all the way to the universal design kind of pinnacle that Allison is talking about, but certainly wanting to think in terms of incentives, because we know that, again, developers, especially people who are trying to do affordable housing, have so many different challenges. And so how can we, is there a way to reduce some system development charges if you do more accessible units, or add some points if you're going to do some set asides or things like that. So it's kind of in the works, and that first step of directing, and also we just don't even, as Madeline pointed out, we don't know the full scope of the need, and so it's also through the Oregon Housing, the needs analysis that's also going to be happening across the state, including accessibility and disability in that. Those numbers will also help us to know more information about what is needed, and then have incentives to follow. So small steps, there's much more to go on that, but we're at least in the process.
Coming your way.
As we know, there's always more people than there are units. So I'm just curious for these that are exclusively for disabilities. What does your wait list look like on that?
Are you asking me that, or?
Whoever.
So just to be clear, for us, we don't have the units ourselves. We just go and find accessible units and affordable units. What has started to happen since our program launched is when people have an accessible unit open up, they have started to call us, because one of the things that we have found from the housing community is we'd love to have somebody who needs it, but I don't know how to find somebody with a disability on my list. So we have been able to make that connection when property managers have called us. But in general, we're looking at the whole marketplace. We don't have units ourselves. So I'll let you answer for yours.
Yeah, so we don't manage the wait list ourselves. Obviously, people, because they're vouchered, they go through OHCS and people are on the wait list for Win Watts Commons. I believe we're over 100 people right now for the wait list. I mean, so absolutely. I mean, and there's a lot of bureaucracy for people with IDD to access these units, right? They have to show they have to work with their case manager to demonstrate that they're 30% AMI. They have to, show how much they're making. I mean, the nice thing about our units are if somebody doesn't have income and they get pulled off of the wait list, they don't pay anything and they get to live there because it's 30% of their income. But there is absolutely more need than there is units available, for sure.
Goodness. All right. Did someone over here? Coming your way, and then I'll come back for you.
I'm wondering about, so of course, like affordable and accessible housing, there's never enough of it. And I really appreciated what you had said about how this universal design is helpful and accommodating for all sorts of folks, regardless of mobility issues or if they use a wheelchair. However, I'm wondering if a certain amount of units are reserved for folks who do need that accessibility more than others. Again, I see the benefit for everyone, but the need higher for people who are in wheelchairs or have other mobility issues. So how is that sorted out?
I mean, what I can say for Win Watts Commons is I believe that they cannot prioritize, at least for the units that are accessible that we have. I believe that I think there's maybe a handful of people that are wheelchair users in the units. And so I don't know if that's just because they're associated with vouchers. We can't, direct, but I don't know if in your case it's different.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is, again, it depends on how their waiting list is set up. Right. So if people actually ask about it and can show that there is a need for physical access, because again, accessibility is a very wide range, but here talking specifically about physical access, right? So for some people or some property managers, they can go through their list and at least see if there's anybody that does meet it. As I mentioned, there's also some times now where people are calling us to say, hey, we have this unit. We would love for it to actually go to somebody who uses a wheelchair. Do you have somebody on your list? But again, that's all voluntary. They're not required to. And again, one of the things that we're hoping to continue to move forward to actually have folks with disabilities designated as a priority population. And then you can start to get a little more clear. But right now it's just kind of on a voluntary basis.
So full disclosure, I don't actually have a question, but I wanted to do an introduction and a shameless plug. So I'm Joe Thompson. I'm with Mercy Housing Northwest, and we're primarily in Washington State, but we're really excited that we're opening our first Oregon project in April 2024. And we're a nonprofit developer owner service provider, and we're actually doing two very similar projects up in Washington State, and where we are. So 20% of the units that will be set aside for folks with IDD, we partnered with two really great service providers in the area. We'll be the owner because they weren't necessarily interested in owning the housing, but but we're going to be co-located with them where they're going to essentially put their headquarters, their offices on the ground floor. Another one is going to do an early learning center and a community center for that will be designed and open for folks with IDD. I just so I would really love to be able to talk with both of you. And the first one is set to break ground in a couple months, and then the other one we're working on the funding. I think one of the interesting things, and frankly one of the things that made it possible, is we also were able to locate them at our rapid transit stations, which really also helps address one of the big needs too. So anyway, I'll leave some cards here, and I'd love to chat with you afterwards. So thanks.
Thank you. I know one of those projects. All right, we've got a question from Zoom. This is for Jennifer. Could you speak to Community Vision's partnerships with housing providers and/or developers? How do you locate affordable units for your clients?
I would love to comment on that. So we started with the people who were interested, right? And that in the Portland metro area were all the CDCs. So the community development corporations. We are so lucky to have amazing affordable housing developers. And so for some folks, we've actually been able to get in on the design phase, and that's part of why we have the Universal Design Guide. So we're working with Rose and Reach and that Sabin project and Home Forward, which has been really exciting. And so that's where we started was, hey, do we have a mutual interest here? Are you willing to work together? And then often when we have worked together for that, then they have done some set asides for folks with disabilities, at least in that initial round, right? To be able to make sure that some folks are included. So that has been really wonderful. And then outside of that, we've just done a ton of research because we've learned that while there's not that many maybe owners, the property managers rule the world. So that was a big learning curve, and all the properties have different property managers. And so we have just built our own database, honestly. So if any of you have any affordable housing that might not be in our database, we'd love to know about it. Because again, that's our whole point is we'd love it if, the cities had some sort of database like this, but we don't know of anything that exists. So we just built it ourselves. And so that has been our goal is to just kind of mine anything that's available in the Portland metro area.
I can actually speak a little bit to that and
Please.
to what you were commenting on. So I work in blended senior and people with younger folks with disabilities housing, and I'm a service coordinator, so this is not totally my role. But what I do know is that we have a tenant selection plan that guides how we manage our wait list, and that's by our contract with HUD. So 10% of our buildings need to be under 62 with a disability, and we have accessible units scattered through our buildings. And we will actually tap into both lists when we have an accessible unit come open, and we will bump people to the top. So I'd love to give you our contact information. I know we have one coming open soon. And then we actually also have a policy that if somebody moves into an accessible unit that doesn't require those features, that they sign something that says that if we do have someone come to the top of our wait list or someone in the building needs to transfer into an accessible unit, that we will move that person to another unit in order to free up that accessible unit. So that's something that we do.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. Oh, perfect.
Oh, it was just a quick question. For coordinating of housing of these individuals, do you work just strictly in the Portland metro area, or do you work across the river?
Is that for me? So far, we have just stuck with Portland Metro, and the reason is actually not because of housing, but because of services. So services are just disability services are fundamentally different across the river, even though it shouldn't be that way. State to state, there's huge changes. And so that is why, at least for now, we are just doing Portland Metro.
We've got one more. from our friend Stacy.
I'll just ask one more question too, of Albertina Care. So one of the challenges for developers that we found to build for below 30% AMI is they can't make money off the rent, right? And so operations and maintenance over time become a big challenge. How have you guys thought about how to plan for that?
Oh, that is the $1 million question. Asset management is a huge piece of something that we're concerned about. Obviously, you know, we've planned, and if all goes well and we collect all the rents that we anticipate, we have built in, you know, money every year going to capital improvements, right? So I mean, we have a plan, and you know, if everybody is, if the building continues to be filled and everyone pays their rent, we should be okay with a little bit of, you know, kind of you know, as the developer owner, you know, at the end of the day, if there's a small amount left, it comes back to Albertina Kerr. And so that's obviously the goal, right? But that, and I'm talking like $200,000 a year. I'm not talking about a huge amount of money, but in the event that we don't make those numbers, we have to be prepared to use that money to actually reinvest back into the building, because we are committed to it being an affordable housing complex for its entirety. But yeah, those are the stressors. I think of being an owner of a building like this. I often think, you know, in 20 years, and when I have to replace that roof and all those solar panels, oof, that's going to be expensive. But we've tried to build it into the plan.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and expertise with this room today. And if you're interested in learning more about this population, we have several other sessions coming up. In fact, there's one starting in this room next, focused on supported living, making affordable housing work for everyone. So hope you'll join us.
And just a quick plug, if you want to sign up for that Universal Design Toolkit, come right up here. And I saw him, I just want to give a little shout out to Brian from Bora Architecture. I saw him come in after I did the big reveal. So Brian and his team have been amazing in helping us create that. So I just wanted to give a little shout out. Thanks, everybody.